I came into the conversation knowing I was hurt. I left wondering if I was the problem. Most manipulation does not begin with someone obviously trying to control you. It does not always begin with yelling, or threats, or dramatic cruelty. Sometimes it begins with a conversation that leaves you less sure of yourself than before. You bring up something that hurts you, and somehow, by the end of the conversation, you are the one apologizing. You say no, and suddenly you feel cruel. You explain your feelings, and somehow your feelings become the problem. You enter the conversation with one clear thought: that hurt me. But you leave thinking, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I should not have said anything. Maybe I am the problem. This is why manipulation can be so hard to recognize, because it does not always feel like control at first. Sometimes it feels like guilt. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like trying very hard to be fair to someone who keeps making you abandon yourself. And this matters. Not every difficult person is manipulating you. Not every argument is abuse. Not every disagreement means someone is trying to control how you see things. But certain patterns matter. Patterns that repeatedly leave you confused, guilty, smaller, and less able to trust your own perception. Patterns that slowly move you away from what you felt, what you saw, and what you knew before the conversation began. Manipulation is not always about forcing you to do something. Sometimes it is about shaping the emotional conditions until you choose against yourself. So this video is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about learning to notice what keeps happening to your ability to trust yourself. Because sometimes the clearest sign is not how the conversation begins. It is how you feel after it ends. One of the clearest signs of manipulation is this: you leave the conversation more confused than when you entered it. A healthy conversation can still be uncomfortable. It can still involve disagreement, but usually it moves toward more clarity. Even if it is painful, you understand more than you did before. A manipulative conversation often does the opposite. You come in with one simple point: something hurt you, something felt wrong, something crossed a line. But somehow the conversation keeps moving away from that point. You say, "I felt hurt when you said that." They say, "I can't believe you would think that about me." You say, "That made me uncomfortable." They say, "You always make me the bad person." Now the original issue disappears. You are no longer talking about what hurt you. You are defending your right to have noticed it. This is where confusion becomes powerful. The more confused you become, the easier it is for the other person to decide where the conversation goes. You start trying to prove that you are not unfair, not dramatic, and not wrong for feeling what you felt. And without realizing it, you have moved far away from the original pain. You are no longer asking, "Why did that hurt me?" You are asking, "Am I allowed to feel hurt at all?" Confusion alone does not always mean manipulation. People misunderstand each other. People remember things differently. People communicate badly. But when confusion becomes a repeated pattern, it becomes information. Especially when every conversation about your pain somehow ends with you doubting whether your pain was real. A healthy conversation may be uncomfortable, but it usually gives you more clarity. A manipulative conversation often makes you question the clarity you came in with. And often, that happens because your feelings become the new problem. One of the most common ways manipulation works is by shifting attention away from what happened and onto how you reacted. You are no longer talking about the comment that hurt you. You are talking about whether you are too sensitive. You are no longer talking about the boundary they crossed. You are talking about whether you are being difficult. You are no longer talking about the way they spoke to you. You are talking about whether your tone was too intense. This is often called emotional invalidation. It means your feelings are not explored. They are dismissed, minimized, blamed, or treated as unreasonable. It does not always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounds casual. You're overthinking. It was just a joke. You always take things the wrong way. You're making this a big deal. I can't say anything around you. On the surface, these sentences may sound small, but over time, they teach you that your feelings are not something to understand. They are something to defend. So before you speak, you start preparing. You soften your words. You add disclaimers. You say, I'm not trying to start an argument. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. I don't want to make you feel bad. You begin protecting the other person from your feelings before your feelings have even been heard. That is one of the quiet costs of emotional invalidation. It does not only silence what you say, it changes your relationship with what you feel. You begin treating your own emotional signals like unreliable information. But feelings are not always final truth. They are signals. They are information. They are trying to show you that something inside you has been affected. A healthy person may not always agree with your interpretation, but they can still respect that your emotional experience is real. But when someone keeps turning your feelings into the problem, there is often no room for that. Because if your feeling is real, then their behavior may need to be faced. So your feeling becomes the issue. The conversation changes from, "What happened?" to, "Why are you like this?" And once your feelings are treated like the problem, your boundaries become easier to turn against you. A boundary should not feel like a crime. But when guilt is used as pressure, your no can start to feel cruel. You say you cannot do something, and suddenly you feel selfish. You ask for space, and suddenly you feel heartless for needing space. You say you are uncomfortable, and suddenly you feel like you have betrayed someone. This is where guilt becomes pressure, not healthy guilt. Healthy guilt helps you repair real harm. If you hurt someone, guilt can help you take responsibility, apologize, and grow. But manipulative guilt is different. Manipulative guilt makes you feel responsible for harm you did not cause. It makes someone else's disappointment feel like proof that you did something wrong. You say, I cannot do that today. They say, after everything I have done for you? You say, I need time to think. They say, so I guess I do not matter. You say, I am not comfortable with that. They say, wow, I did not know you were that kind of person. Now your boundary is no longer a boundary. it becomes a character flaw. You are not simply saying no, you are selfish, ungrateful, cold, difficult, unloving. This is how manipulation turns self-protection into shame. And if it happens often enough, you may stop waiting for the other person to punish your boundary. You begin punishing it yourself. You say yes before they even pressure you. You stay quiet before they even react. You make your needs smaller before they even ask, because you already know the emotional cost of having a limit. That is why this line matters. A boundary is not cruel just because someone is disappointed by it. Someone can feel disappointed and still respect your no. Someone can disagree with your boundary and still not turn it into evidence that you are a bad person. But if every no becomes a trial, every limit becomes a fight, and every need becomes something you must defend, the relationship is teaching you that your boundaries are only allowed when they do not inconvenience the other person. And when guilt works, you may try to fix it the only way you know how. You explain, then explain again, then explain until you forget your original point. Over-explaining often begins as hope. You hope that if you say it clearly enough, they will understand. If you choose the right words, they will stop twisting your meaning. If you soften your tone, they will finally hear you. So you keep trying. You explain, then clarify, then defend, then apologize for how it came out. And by the end, you are exhausted. But you are not even sure what you were trying to say anymore. You began with something simple. I did not like how you spoke to me. They say, what exactly did I say? You answer. They say, that is not what I meant. You explain again. They say, you are taking it out of context. You explain more carefully. They say, you are impossible to talk to. Now the conversation is no longer about how they spoke to you. It is about whether you are reasonable enough, calm enough, and precise enough to be heard. You are no longer trying to communicate. You are trying to prove that your reaction deserves to exist. This is why over-explaining can become a trap. In a healthy conversation, more clarity usually helps. When someone wants to understand you, clarification can bring you closer. But when someone wants to control the meaning of the conversation, clarity keeps moving further away. Every explanation becomes another place to debate. Every sentence becomes another thing to correct. Every detail becomes another way to move away from the original point. That does not mean you should never explain yourself. Explanation is part of healthy communication. But there is a difference between explaining yourself to be understood and explaining yourself to earn permission to feel hurt. That second kind can slowly train you to abandon your own point. Because the more you try to become impossible to misunderstand, the more you begin shaping yourself around someone else's refusal to understand you. At some point, the question becomes, am I being heard or am I being worn down? And one reason this is so confusing is that they may not always seem cruel. Sometimes they are just kind enough to keep you unsure. Manipulation would be easier to recognize if the person were harmful all the time. If they were always cruel, dismissive, cold, or controlling, the pattern might be easier to name. but often it is not that simple. Sometimes they are kind. Sometimes they apologize. Sometimes they say the right thing. Sometimes they act like the person you hoped they would be. And that is what makes you doubt yourself. Because your mind is trying to hold two truths at once. They hurt me, and they can also be kind. Psychologists call this tension cognitive dissonance. It is the discomfort of holding two conflicting realities in your mind at the same time. And because that discomfort is painful, your mind tries to reduce it. So you start explaining away the harm. Maybe they did not mean it. Maybe they were just stressed. Maybe I am focusing too much on the bad parts. Maybe I should be more understanding. And maybe the good side is who they really are. This does not mean you are foolish. It means you are trying to make sense of mixed evidence. The apology makes you question the pattern. The affection makes the hurt feel less clear. The warm day makes you doubt the cold week. This can also connect to intermittent reinforcement, when positive moments appear inconsistently, not enough to make you secure, but enough to keep you waiting. Waiting for the kind version to return, waiting for the apology to become change, waiting for the good moments to finally become the pattern instead of the exception. But here is the part you need to hear. The good moments may explain why you stay confused, but they do not erase what keeps happening to you. A person can have real good qualities and still keep repeating a pattern that hurts you. A person can love you in some moments and still make you lose trust in yourself in others. The question is not, are they always bad? The question is, what is the pattern? And if the pattern keeps repeating, something deeper begins to happen. You start trusting their version more than your own. This is the part of manipulation that can be the hardest to explain. Because at first, the damage seems to be happening between you and them. But over time, it starts changing the way you relate to yourself. You stop asking, "What did I feel?" You start asking, "Will they agree that I am allowed to feel this?" You stop asking, "What happened?" You start asking, "Will they admit that it happened?" You stop asking, "Did that hurt me?" You start asking, "Can I prove that I had a right to be hurt?" This is where the word gaslighting matters. The word is often overused, so it is important to be precise. Gaslighting is not just lying. A lie hides the truth. Gaslighting makes you doubt your ability to recognize the truth. It is a repeated pattern that makes someone question their own perception, memory, feelings, or sense of reality. In everyday life, it can sound like, "That never happened. You are remembering it wrong. You always exaggerate. You are twisting my words. You are too emotional to see this clearly." At first, you may argue back. You may say, "No, I remember what happened. No, that is not what I meant. No, I know what I felt." But after enough repetition, you begin to hesitate. You replay conversations. You question your memory. You wonder if the hurt was real or if you are being unfair. And slowly, you start needing their version before trusting your own. This is why manipulation is so dangerous. It does not only influence what you do, it can make you lose confidence in the part of you that knows when something is wrong. At some point, the question is no longer only whether they are telling the truth. The question is why you keep needing their permission to trust your own. You may never win the argument about what happened. You may never get the perfect confession, but you can still notice what keeps happening to you, and that is where your clarity begins to return. Instead of asking only, "Are they a bad person?" ask something more useful. What happens to me after I interact with them? Because you may not always be able to prove intention, you may not be able to prove that someone meant to manipulate you. You may not be able to prove that every sentence was planned. But repeated effects still matter. After you talk to them, do you feel more confused, more guilty, smaller? Do you start trusting yourself less? Do you become careful with every word? Do you feel responsible for their emotions? Do you keep abandoning the point you came in with? And when you are around them, do you feel more like yourself or less like yourself? These questions matter because manipulation is not always visible in one dramatic moment. Sometimes you see it most clearly afterward. The way your body tenses before you reply, the way you rehearse every sentence, the way you apologize just to end the silence, the way you feel relieved when they are kind, even if nothing has actually changed. You do not need to prove they meant to hurt you before you are allowed to notice that every interaction leaves you trusting yourself less. That does not mean you should accuse everyone. It does not mean you should diagnose people. It does not mean you should call every difficult relationship manipulative. It means you are allowed to observe patterns. You are allowed to take what happens inside you afterward seriously. You are allowed to notice that a relationship repeatedly leaves you less free, less clear, and less able to trust yourself. And this is where the most important lesson begins. You do not need perfect proof to trust a pattern. You do not need to prove someone is evil before you are allowed to protect your inner life. You do not need to diagnose them. You do not need to win the argument. You do not need to collect perfect evidence for every feeling you have. You do not need to convince them that the pattern is real before you are allowed to notice that it is hurting you. A repeated pattern is information. If every honest conversation leaves you confused, that matters. If every boundary leaves you guilty, that matters. If every attempt to explain yourself ends with you apologizing for having a reaction, that matters. You do not need 5 perfect pieces of evidence. A repeated emotional pattern is already information. This does not mean you become suspicious of everyone. It means you become honest about what repeatedly happens to your clarity. You can be fair without abandoning yourself. You can understand someone's pain without letting it control your response. You can care about someone and still recognize that being around them keeps making you smaller. You can protect your clarity without becoming cold. Because the goal is not to turn every person into a villain. The goal is to stop turning yourself into the problem every time something inside you says, "This does not feel right." You protect yourself not by becoming suspicious of everyone. You protect yourself by learning to trust what repeated patterns reveal. So maybe the final question is not, "Are they a bad person?" Maybe the deeper question is, what pattern have you been explaining away because you do not want to believe it is real? Because sometimes your confusion is not a sign that you are too sensitive. Sometimes it is the part of you that still remembers the truth before someone taught you to doubt it.